Okay.
Uh,
So yeah, we were talking about
where
um,
were we? Oh yeah.
again going back to the one of the other things that I think it's worth mentioning in relation to the period during which I was studying, and this is a thorny subject, but the whole idea of the very definition of art. One of the things that I always encourage students anywhere
Hmm.
to avoid is getting caught up in endless arguments and discussions about what the word art means. Because during the time that I was a student, the term art and the word artist were increasingly being appropriated by one particular group, and it was the group who were producing what we think of as conceptual art. And I don't have any problem at all with conceptual art, with abstraction, with putting a bed or a shark in formaldehyde, that idea. I do have a problem with the Tracy Emin idea that it's art because I say it's art, because that works in both directions. It's shit because I say it's shit. You know, it's a fatuous thing to say. I don't have an issue with any of that. Where I have a problem is when you get groups of people, particularly critics and educators, who side with one particular section of the creative artistic population and say, this is now art. Everything else is over, done, finished. We must wipe that off the map.
Hmm.
And that was gradually what was happening with representational art, to the point where when we were doing the Animation Basecamp in 2016, we were bringing in Sarah Arias, who's an animator and designer with Disney, and she's now in the UK working here on a comic book project, but working as a freelance animator on all kinds of projects. We wanted her to come in and do gesture drawing with the students, but Glasgow Caledonian University, our host, constantly asserts the fact that, oh, we're not an art school, so we don't have the kit. And I thought, great, we will borrow easels and drawing boards from the Glasgow School of Art. Little did I know, and this was before it burned down,
Yeah.
because it was allowed to burn down last summer.
And
But
it did it again this year as well. It did twice.
yeah, they couldn't even lend us easels.
What?
Now that ought to have been. And when I went to Norway to teach in 2015, I realised 2 weeks before I flew over there they didn't have easels and drawing boards either. And I said, and they said, "Why does that really matter?" And I said, "Well, you've been doing drawing classes up until now. What have they been doing?" They're like, "Well, they get printer paper, or they put the paper on the table in front of them, and we get in it." And I'm like, but there is a reason to draw on a drawing board and an easel. It's a physical reason.
Hmm.
You stand there, and if you're looking at paper that is flat on the table in front of you, you have to keep raising your head up to look at the thing you're drawing and tilting your head down to look at the drawing.
Yeah.
When you're standing at an easel, all that has to move is your eyeballs. You can get to a point in the flow of what you're doing where you are making the mark as you're observing the subject. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. And when they said to me, the guy said, "Oh, do we need the drawing boards and the easels?" I said, "Well, you want me to teach them how to draw?
Hmm.
This is the equivalent of saying, well, we've got an Olympic-sized swimming pool, but we don't actually have any water in it. But is that surely you can like we've gone to all the trouble?" I said, it's that level of stupid that people have forgotten that there was a practical. But you don't just buy an easel and a drawing board so the neighbors look in your window and think, "Ooh, there's an artist living next door." You buy it because it's part of the tools of your fucking trade.
Yeah.
That's what you do. It makes the process and the results more satisfactory. But this idea that as we move through the different trends and fashions, that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have never, never, never done that in sport. We haven't done it in music. We have continued to provide excellence in instrumental teaching for young orchestral musicians. We've continued to provide excellence for young tennis players and footballers. And when my high school art teacher, Mike Gill, passed away in 2015, I spoke at his funeral and I said, the school I was at was run by a company called the Merchant Company, and it's there's all these questions about fee-paying schools and private education and blah blah blah. It's another conversation. But one of the reasons my mother and father sent me to that particular high school, because I'd been pretty miserable in the primary school I was in, was that they had convinced the school governors to allow them to create an entire separate building to teach art and design skills. And to this day, I don't think there's another high school anywhere in Scotland that did that. And I stood at Mike's funeral and I said, we must remember what a revolutionary this guy was, that he said, no, design matters, art matters, typography matters. But, he felt passionately that these were things that we needed to support and encourage, to the point where there was a specialist facility, the same way that we invest in laboratories for scientific exploration for chemistry, biology, and physics, the same way that we invest in expensive sport facilities, music facilities. We cannot expect to make any of the achievements or advances that we need to make at this point in human history if people are talking about STEM, and if we are even having an argument about calling it STEAM, this idea of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. No, science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. Mm-hmm. If Leonardo da Vinci was born today, he would not be allowed to be a poet, an architect, an illustrator, a sculptor, a weapons systems designer. He would have to choose one or other, and he would have to specialize. What the hell is a specialization? If somebody actually has a talent and ability, why on earth would you close that area of their capability off for some kind of intellectual or thematic reason? It's like, no, if somebody is good at something, let them be good at it. And let's see how everyone can benefit from their enjoyment of the process of acquiring and exercising those skills. As long, of course, as what they're good at is productive, non-violent, wonderful. But the tragedy in the UK economy is that an enormous amount. One of the interesting things when I got involved in software in 1993, I spent 2 years working for Cambridge Animation Systems, and I went into the software industry because my father had always said to me that you need to pay attention to the changes in technology because the transition to digital typesetting had been absolutely catastrophic for the UK print industries, both for newspaper and for publishing. And he had lived through that whole process where the original hot metal type press unions didn't want the new digital typesetting. And he said, when you see new technologies coming in, either embrace them and ride the wave or wait for the wave to go over your head. That's all that happens. Yeah. But when I was working for Cambridge Animation Systems, a young man joined the team. And he'd been educated in Cambridge as a computer programmer, and he had been working for a big company in Australia. And we went for lunch one day, and he said, I never imagined, with my training and my skill, I would ever have the opportunity to work with animators. He said, I think this is really thrilling and exciting. And that kind of piqued my curiosity. And I said, okay, well, if you are a really good computer programmer, what are the jobs that are open to you when you graduate? He said, oh, it's simple. You either go into banking or munitions. And I said, what? He said, yeah, it's either money or weapons.
Wow.
And I thought, oh my God, what we were able to do in the 1990s, that all these people whose only financial economic option was to be involved in the arms trade or in the international banking industry, both of which have been responsible for terrible social catastrophic breakdown. These are destructive processes a lot of the time. Yeah. This is, going off into the Naomi Klein disaster capitalism route, which is other
discussion.
But when we look at what we have been able to do creatively with software that was developed on a military budget for navigational purposes and flight simulators, now we have this opportunity to share, to communicate, to solve problems together, and we are finding intelligent ways of using these methods and techniques and processes where a lot of this stuff was generated and motivated out of fear. This was all part of the previous generation or the previous era of people finding reasons to go to war with one another. And it's like we can't afford to be doing this any longer. What we ought to be doing as communicators. It was sad last week. It's sad that we've lost Richard Williams this week. It was very sad that we lost Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize-winning American author. She was one of the foremost African-American writers. And when Trump was elected, she said, it's at times like this that artists get busy. And again, people will say, well, the reason that we don't bother with these things, Fraser, is that, animation is not a matter of life and death. And I'm like, really? That's interesting. Okay, well, tell that to the people who have been through surgery where ahead of the operation, the surgeon was able to take the data from an MRI scan of your tumor, feed that into three-dimensional modeling and animation software, explore the area around the tumor with a virtual headset in 3 dimensions before the surgeon even opens the patient up on the table, and tell me that animation skills are not a matter of life and death.
Yeah.
We have these processes and these talents and these skills being used in cancer research, manufacturing, civil engineering, urban planning, climate modeling, and still people are going, oh, what's an animator do? What's art for? You're like, what on earth do you think it's for?
It's literally everything. That's the thing. It's like cause we could do this podcast forever, right? So there's like so many different things that you've made. Oh gosh, this is good. Right. So the gee whiz, I'm trying to think how to say this. You've you've literally just made my mind explode of just so much stuff. I'm trying to think what to say now. I've been put on the spot.
I think the thing that is one of the problems that we're up against anywhere that people are trying to encourage the next generation of visual communicators, a lot of it is to do with terminology. I had an ongoing argument this week about the use of the word itself, of the word animation. And I feel that it has an importance, particularly here in Mexico at the moment. And a lot of the people I'm working with have a different opinion. So there was a strong argument about that, a conversation about that this week.
Right.
But what I was trying to get when I was working in Norway, they were still describing some of the courses in the university where I was teaching as film. And I said, could we please stop using this term? Because we've actually stopped using the material. Nobody is recording or projecting images on or from film. Film doesn't exist as part of the process any longer. That clear cellulose that was, we are not using film. So we should stop using the word. And I argued that we needed to find a term that could outlive any of the changes in technology now or in the future. And I said, what we should be looking at is referring to these skills in the educational and training context as moving image communication skills, or MIC in English.
Okay.
Because that's what we're all doing. We're using movement and imagery to communicate with people. So what I try to get students to think of is like this was when I was doing the first chapter of setting the scene, the definition of cinematography. So photography is made up of photo, which is light, and graph, which is image making or mark making. And then when you introduce kine, or the kinetic or the movement part of it, cinematography is communication through images that are moving. You're using light and movement to create an image and communicate a message. But what you are always doing is you are trying to influence people. And this idea that there is some kind of cinema verite, that you can arrive at the truth with a sequence of images, is nonsense. You can't arrive at the truth with a sequence of words.
Yeah.
People who are in the room at the same time as a particular sequence of events will all walk away and record and report it slightly differently. And we ought not to be afraid of having a viewpoint. We ought not to be afraid of having an opinion. And we ought not to be concerned about the impact that it will have if we share that opinion. It's indicative of the fact that we are so accustomed to being manipulated and to surrendering to that manipulation that we develop this kind of conceit about, I don't want somebody to influence what I'm doing, saying, buying, or voting for. But that's why the acquisition of these skills is so crucially important, because there are so many people and organizations and companies using these same skills to do terrible things and to convince people to do wasteful things with resources. Clear example, I was using the Winston cigarettes advert that Barney Rubble and Fred Flintstone were animated to sell cigarettes in the early 1960s. And I showed that commercial on YouTube to my students here in Mexico. Right. And it's a disturbing commercial because there are elements in it that are supposed to be funny, but they are about the process of buying and selling tobacco and nicotine, which is carcinogenic, addictive, damaging. And even the casual sexism that was used in the scripting of the thing. We advance, we make progress, we make mistakes. But what we must do is not turn around and say, okay, only these people with that message can have access to these processes and these toolkits, because that's how dictatorships prosper. Because you narrow down the range of people who have access to the medium to communicate. But also, it means that when we're encouraging people to be animators, to be storytellers, to be movie makers, we also need to encourage people to develop an ethical perspective about what they're doing. And we've seen this shift recently. A lot of the people in London used to make their living by creating animated commercials for breakfast cereal. But now it is recognized that the process of adulterating a valuable cereal crop with sugar, food dye, marshmallow is a bad thing. The way that getting people to smoke filtered or non-filtered cigarettes was also a bad thing. But a lot of what was being done was they were targeting specifically children. There was even a term in the advertising industry of pester power. You use animated characters to promote and sell products where the child will see that advertisement on television when they come home from school and go through to the kitchen and say to their parent or caregiver, I think that's the brand of cereal that I want on the table next, tomorrow morning.
Mm-hmm.
And these things are so prevalent, they're so present, they're so familiar that often we stop standing back and questioning them. The entire reason to become an observational artist is to ask questions.
Definitely.
Ask questions and
All the
solve
time.
problems. You can't solve a problem that you haven't identified and understood first. The danger if you try and solve a problem before you've actually grasped what the problem is that you will create another sequence of problems in that effort because you're making an effort unwisely or without guidance. And I think that the core in all of this is not about trying to assert who we are as individuals, but who we are as humans in the social context, in the collective context. And that's why that whole original 1980s idea of get famous, be notorious, be a controversial artist. No, be a good artist or a good designer, and don't give a shit if people do or don't know and celebrate and promote your individual name or brand.
Mm-hmm.
Do something helpful, do something useful, do something positive, do something non-violent, non-destructive with it. Because if you don't do that, loads of other people will be jumping on these toolkits and these bandwagons to use them for really questionable purposes, which you will then often get swept up in. So, it's a lot of this is about making choices about the kind of world that we want to present and live in. And when people say animation is not a matter of life and death, to me, it's always indicative of the fact they just have no idea what they're talking about.
What it is and stuff. That's always the crazy thing as well. It's like, so coming back to one of your early points as well. It's like, do you like when people always say like, oh, so I've done many podcasts, and everyone is pretty much a specialist, or they have that title as they specialize in, say, environment art, concept art, character art, animation, you name it, whatever it is. And like you said, it's obviously been developed through early studies of being told, right, you have to choose a profession. And the one thing, so there's 2 points I'm wanting to make here and bring up. So the first thing is like, so when I'm doing my artwork, so for example, my main specialty is the title environment art. However, my main passion comes through my mixture of character art to make my environment sell more meaning, or have at least a meaning behind it. And this is why, for example, going back to your point earlier that you said about when people do life drawing. So a lot of people, especially 3D artists or artists these days, use more than one monitor. And the biggest mistake, this is why I don't, so I use multiple monitors, but I use them not for art. So what I do is I use a software called ZBrush, so a sculpting software. And what I do is I half the screen. So I have half the screen on one monitor is ZBrush, and then the other half is my reference. And the reason why I do that is based off the point that you said earlier about having that glance over, so it doesn't mean I have to turn my head.
Yeah.
So I do that, and then like the other point was like what you said about the specialty thing. So it's like I don't understand why there's always like this sort of order thing, as in just because you're not a character artist doesn't mean you can't have your opinion. And like when I'm doing my art, I always like to constantly think about characters and have my character within the scene, or at least explore it. Even if I'm rubbish at drawing characters, at least it gives me an idea of space. It gives me an idea of layout and everything. It really gets me to actually think more about the art piece itself. If that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. No, I mean, that's one of the crucial things, that when you're creating an environment in which part of a story is going to take place, your responsibility is not to compete with the characters that are going through the events that are described in the script and the narrative. Your job is to create a series of performance spaces and framing devices for that action. That's your job. But what happens so often is that people who decide they want to get involved in level design or environment design or character design, one of the things that routinely I see in early portfolio work is an oversupply of detail.
Yep.
People putting far too much surface detail or render, and these are, practical problems further down the line for rendering, whether you're using a game engine or whatever else it is. But it's also a question of what the human visual system can actually process and digest. And this is the other thing that's at the center of most of my teaching. I don't begin a series of classes with people in any area now of animation design or visual communication without asking them, encouraging them to consider how the human eye is put together and how the human visual cortex processes the information that is sent to it from the light hitting the retina and the information traveling up the optic nerve. I studied for 5 years and nobody told me anything about the human visual system. You have a genius physicist like James Clerk Maxwell, who took the first ever color photograph in 1861, 100 years before I was born. There is a statue to him in George Street in Edinburgh. You can stand at the bottom of the statue.
Awesome.
And people don't know who the guy was. Yeah. But he was the guy who understood, first of all, and researched and explored to find out why we see in 3 primary colors, why we are trichromate. Mm-hmm. Now, when you're an environment designer, when you're there's a big argument going on in America at the moment about, we are being screwed as artists by the big studios. So they're hiring people to be prop designers and then asking them to design characters also. They're hiring people as story artists and asking them to do timing. And all these people are getting angry about it and saying that this is exploitation. I'm not entirely convinced that it is exploitation, because if any individual artist is capable of doing more than one thing, I don't see any particular reason why they have to have this badge or that t-shirt or that union membership card to say, I could draw this prop, but I'm not going to, because we will get into trouble with the union if the person in the next room doesn't draw the prop. If you're capable of, it goes back to the thing about Leonardo da Vinci and multitasking. I am not arguing for exploitation of people. I'm not arguing for people doing work and not being paid for it. I am arguing against the idea that we wouldn't encourage people to be good at more than one thing. More than one thing. We shouldn't create a system whereby they have to seek permission to cross the line and do X, Y, or Z. Because if you've got a small company that only has 5 full-time employees and somebody passes some law or regulation saying, you're a prop designer, you're a storyboard artist, you mustn't do this. A lot of tiny companies depend on multitasking. And if you get offended at an insistence on multitasking because large corporations or studios are wanting to do something exploitative by getting people to do more than one thing while they're in the building, those are kind of 2 different problems that you can't solve with the same gesture or the same legislation or the same set of rules.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do when we're teaching people to be good at scenic design or lighting design or color is to be aware, first and foremost, of what the influence is universally across cultural boundaries of particular combinations or color contrasts, of particular kinds of geometry, of particular kinds of positions of lighting sources. The human face. If you put a lighting source above the human face, everything looks okay. The moment you take the same lighting source and position it below the chin of the character, it looks menacing and frightening, because that's a primal reaction to the geometry of the patterns of the shadow on the human face. You can terrify a baby by putting a flashlight under the chin of the parent it's familiar with.
Yeah.
And this is before language comes in and they know to be frightened, because it's a routine that if you're telling a ghost story around a campfire, you put the flashlight under your face. But these are primal responses to what the information is doing when it gets to the visual cortex. And we're asking people to be visual artists and visual communicators without educating people about the human visual system. We've got a lot of things that are existing in isolation, a lot of things that are in a little bubble over here or a little bubble over there. We need these things to relate. Otherwise, the danger is that we will get off into one particular area and solve one particular set of problems without realizing the potential negative impact that that problem solving will have on something that is directly related that we have been conditioned to ignore or to tune out. And this is it's all about being aware. You know, that's why the observational part of it is important. And a lot of this stuff now, you know, people, 10 years ago, a huge majority of the students wanted to be character animators. Now, almost everybody I ask says they want to be a concept artist. When you tell them that there are way fewer jobs in what they think of as concept art than they have come to imagine, they're like, oh, no, but I saw it on a website. You know, I follow all these concept artists on some channel or whatever.
Like ArtStation or something.
But even if that's the cool, sexy job now, I guarantee you in 5 years' time it won't be. And what happens so often is it's not a question of us choosing a career. The careers very often choose us. That's what's happened to me all along. You know, I got into film editing because the ACTT, which was the governing union that became Baxter, even though there were 5 million people in Scotland the year that I graduated, the ACTT had a closed shop system. They would only permit 3 new people into the film and television industries in all of Scotland every year.
Every year, wow. Right.
Limited that to the technical grades. You could not train to be a production designer. You could not train to be an art director, much less an animator. You had to choose to train in either camera, sound, or editing. And the reason I chose editing was that the Glasgow School of Art had spent money on video equipment, and the big sexy thing in the 1980s was video. Nobody gives a shit about video and film any longer because neither of things, you know, these things have been superseded by other stuff, and it's terribly easy for people to get caught up and go, hey, I want to be a compositor, or I want to be a this, that. And it's like, dude, you can do that for a while, but while you're busy doing it, all this other shit is going to happen, and you're going to wind up with other options at the end of the process, and you just have to accept that. You can't stop history. You can't halt progress. We are a part of that ongoing process, and it is constantly shifting and developing.
Wow. Thank you so much for all this, Fraser. This has been great.
Anytime.
I've just been sitting and relaxing. This has been amazing. I've been like listening. This is like listening to another podcast. I've had to say anything. I've just had to just chill and relax.
As it should be.
No, that's always the great thing, because it's because this is the main reason that I wanted to bring you on, because you've got so much experience, so much passion, and it's like there's so many things that I wish so many people started doing. And like when it comes to like the education system, like we've had our long discussions before, it's just like there's so many things that they're doing. Like obviously there's a lot of things they're doing right, but there's a lot of things that they're so far behind in. Or like
my central argument is that the priorities should be identical. The education system should be prioritizing according to the priorities of the medical, scientific, engineering, creative. If these institutions are there to provide better employees in the field of research, in the field of manufacturing, in the field of storytelling, in the field of whatever, their priorities need to be identical to the priorities of the industries that they claim to be supporting and feeding with their graduate output. Mm-hmm. If you wind up with a situation where the priorities in the educational institutions are at odds with or competing in any sense with the priorities of, or even if they're just not the same priorities at all, you have a very serious problem. And it's a problem that needs to be addressed and a problem that needs to be solved. It mustn't be a problem that we ignore. The last the last thing that education is about is burying your head in the sand. And the education system itself is a gigantic sand dune with lots of people with their heads planted firmly under the sand because they want the sand dune to carry on existing. And I'm like, look it up in a dictionary. What happens to a sand dune? The wind changes, it moves, But sorry, I'm mixing up my metaphors. But what we need to be doing is ensuring that the education system does what it says on the tin.
Yep.
And not tempting people in with promises of something that it then does not deliver. And I think we need much greater transparency about the movement of money into and through these institutions. Because particularly in the UK, students are asked to part with money under the heading of tuition fees. But a couple of years ago, I was talking with a guy who runs one of the animation courses within one of the universities in Scotland, and he told me 85% of that money vanishes at the door, and he is left with only 15% that he can spend on tuition.
And first of all, the same thing as well. I'm trying to think
if he goes and asks what's happening to the money, first of all, he's branded as a troublemaker, and second of all, he will be told, or in his account, he was told that the money was being spent on administration and management. That's okay with me if that's what it says on the tin. Mm-hmm. But if on the tin it says this is however many £1,000 a year on tuition, it is reasonable for the person spending that money to assume that in return for that investment, they will get tuition. And if that's not what they're getting, then it should say 15% of this will wind up as being tuition. 85% is a bunch of people you will never see in another part of the building, moving paper and statistics around, and you can just wave goodbye to it. You'll never see it back. Because if that person is then graduating with £25,000 worth of debt, they have a right to know where that money went.
Yeah.
And don't have transparency in the education system about how the money is moving around, even though it's our money. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can have transparency about how taxation is being divided up, we need to have that transparency across all of these areas. Otherwise, it's going to turn into a kind of cabal, a kind of self-perpetuating priesthood of people that are all doing very nicely, thank you very much. But what is actually happening to all the money that is being paid into the bank account by the people who are going through for the service, the privilege of being educated in these skills? And if that money is not being invested in that process, we need to know where that money is going. Because if that money is not producing something that is useful to the economy and to the society, then we need to be using it more intelligently.
Because I'm really glad how you finished it off there, because it's like that's the reason why I do the podcast. And I've been trying to figure out, so when I think I told you a few years back, but the reason why I wanted to start the podcast was to try and really get the truth out and try and get the best answers as possible to all the students that have been listening in. And the fact that a lot of, like, for example, I get like a lot of people in the comments section saying, "Oh, thank you, like I've learned all this today and stuff. I've not been taught that," and that's actually worrying when I hear that. And the fact that a person has to rely on, like for example, a podcast to kind of get them the information they actually need to, like they're getting it for free. Like I'm telling, like I do this for free because I love it, and I talk to guests because I love it. And the fact that all this sort of information is more beneficial through just like us talking than their 25 or 100 grand of money, it's madness. And
so by the time you discover it, it's too late. You know
exactly, because that was the case with me.
These processes are targeted at people who are unlikely even to know what questions to ask, because, like I say, the mechanism through which people are encouraged, I would say in some cases even pressured or bullied into going to university when they would rather be doing something else. The only alternative most people consider is a gap year. Like, I'll put on a backpack and I'll, go to Poland or India, or I'll go climbing or do something, but then I'll come back and then I'll sign up and I'll be a student.
Yeah.
But we don't, unless there is I would also recommend, if people are considering signing up for any kind of education or training in any context provided by anybody or any organization, the best way to discover whether you are getting your money's worth is to talk to people who just came out the other end of it and have either struggled to get a job or they've succeeded in getting a job, the best people to ask about the relevance and the quality of the available training on that website in that university is the people who've been through it.
Mm-hmm.
And if what you discover is that somebody who's just spent 5 or 6 years getting themselves into £25,000 worth of debt or more still feels that they're not really, doing so great, then you do not have to go to university. This is something that I wish people understood. It is not a legal requirement. It's not part of the compulsory system. The compulsory system stops after high school. The state does not require you to be there. But a lot of people, it's such a huge pressure and it's such an omnipresent reality. A lot of people, I think, assume at some level that they kind of have to.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, if they don't assume that, they're looking at it and thinking, well, there's no work available. And then you look at it and think, okay, well, how much of an increase is there in the likelihood of you being hired and employed gainfully if you go through this process, accept all this training, get into that amount of debt? Does that actually make you more likely to get hired? And in a lot of instances, the answer, sadly, is no. And if that's the case, then, I quite often, depending on where it is I'm talking to people, who's asking the question and what the context is, I will encourage parents who ask me what, I've got a daughter or a son who wants to do animation, where should they study? I always encourage them to look at options where they might not be studying, but they might actually be working. And I for years took recent graduates down to London to get them to tour animation, post-production and visual effects houses because they were graduating after 4 years in university with a degree in their hand that said they were an animator or this, that or the other, never once having set foot inside a commercial animation company.
Yep.
And during that time, when we went in and out of Moving Picture Company, Rushes, Passion, Uli Meyer, all these different places, the questions that would come up and people would say, how did you get into this line of work? And we were in the color grading suite in 2011 with a group of people from colleges all over Scotland. And one of the people I was standing next to, who, like you, had gone through college, got into debt, asked the guy who had been demonstrating the color grading facilities, how did you get this job? What were you doing immediately before you were working for this company? And he said, I was a bricklayer. And everyone just fell silent. And they said, so you didn't go to college? I went, no. So you didn't study? No. You didn't train? No.
Yep.
They said, well, how did you get in? I said, well, I was working on a building site, and a friend of mine was working here as a runner. And he said, I'm earning a little bit more than you are every hour, and I don't have to be outside in the rain all day long. Why don't you come and be a runner here? And I went around the building so often during the day, giving people coffee and delivering food and pizzas and things. And this was the area where I was most interested in what was happening. And the guy who was running it decided to make me a kind of unofficial apprentice, and 2 years later, I'm running it. Now, if that's possible, from a standing start as a bricklayer on a building site to running the color grading suite, what does that tell you about what you actually need to be a digital color grader in the post-production industry in any part of the world? But the university system is so powerful in terms of what it communicates that it makes people believe that only through their process of 3 or 4 years of intensive study will you ever be within sneezing distance of that kind of employment opportunity. And it is simply not true.
You just reminded me of something crazy.
If education is about anything, it should be about the pursuit of the truth, not about the propagation of a falsehood.
Because do you like the like there's that sort of well, this is the thing that was the biggest, like when I think about it, this is like the biggest shock. But do you like so every artist that was in my year, right, pretty much says a degree means nothing, and it's true, because degrees mean nothing in art, because as long as you can do the art, you're fine. As long as you showcase the portfolio, you're fine. Like, there's nothing, like, it's not, like Fraser said, it's not a requirement. And that's kind of scary to think that when you've gone, so you've been told all these years to go to uni and stuff, and like, I think uni's great, but that's based off my experience. And like, I was really fortunate. For example, I was taught by Fraser, taught by Ian, taught by Brian, Robinson, like all these great teachers and stuff. But like, that's why the research is so important. So when you're starting out early on, like what Fraser said, take the time to really think about why you're going to this place. Do you really need to go there? is really ask the people, like Fraser was saying, ask them, get the information you need to do before you make that step, because that money is like there's I did a podcast, Fraser, with an artist called Tim Simpson, and he didn't go down the university line, and his friend is still paying debt, like, I don't know, 6-7 years after, and he's never had to pay debt, and they're both doing the same job.
I know, and I think that that's a really serious obstacle. You know, starting your adult working life saddled with that amount of debt is an additional anxiety in an industry where you're going to be presented with all kinds of challenges and anxieties anyway. You don't need that additional one as your kind of starting place. And I think that it's really important for people to do the homework, but I think that applies to the universities as well. If they are going to be setting up these courses, they ought to be required by law to do the homework about what the industries are that they're supposed to be supporting. Because, you know, a lot of the universities that I visit and a lot of the universities that I've taught at in lots of different countries, there was never a point where they actually went out and did the homework about that industry. And yet they're sitting there going, if you want to get into this industry, we are the gateway through which you must pass.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how is that legal?
How is that
right
at all? Like, thank you so much for coming on, Fraser.
You're cool.
I think what I'm gonna have to do, I'm gonna have to do this in 2 parts. This is the first time I've ever had to do this. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Best of luck to everybody that's listening, and and every encouragement in what you're doing, and just it's a great world to be a part of. It's not very stable. It's not very predictable. You kind of have to love what you do. Can I finish on a particular quote from James Williams?
On you go.
James came over to speak and participate in a 3-day event at the university that I taught at in Norway, and the event was called And Action. And after he had done his presentation about his own career in animation, one of the students said, well, you were born in Wales, you moved to London, you wound up in Hollywood, you had some time in Germany. As a movie maker, do you think of yourself as a Welsh filmmaker, as British, English, American? And James thought for a second and he said, I don't think of myself as having a nationality in that sense at all. He said, animation is my country.
That's awesome.
And I feel that's an extremely wise, sensible, and helpful way of thinking about it. That in the same way that when you become a working musician or you become a track and field athlete, we all have a sense of, you were describing it yourself, you want to be with your tribe, not because you don't have affection and respect for people who have other preoccupations or skills, but just we all want to feel welcome in the environment where we're going to be doing the work that we do. We all want to feel appreciated. We all want to feel useful. And when you discover that environment, or when that environment finds you, there's a kind of resonance or a sympathetic vibration, and you go, you know what, this is right. And this is what I find at the moment here in Latin America, in Mexico, that the mood amongst all of the animators and designers and storytellers and games designers and comic book artists, it's great to be here at the beginning of something new, because the existing industries in America and Europe, there is a danger that we will begin to think as though we are, American filmmakers or whatever. When people knew I was working at Disney, some people used to say, I don't really like American movies. And I'd say, well, I'm not sure I'm working on one, because all the people who are on the pipeline with me when I was working on Disney, I've got the guy next to me is from Venezuela, the person next to him is from Ireland, there are people here from France. It's a kind of international, global, collective community of extraordinary cultural and ethnic diversity. And if there's any sense for me of identification at all, I would say the same thing as James, that animation is my country, and I would like other people who are becoming citizens of that country to feel welcome and to feel comfortable and to feel that this was home and not a hostile environment.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. That's a perfect way to finish the podcast. As always, by the way, everyone who's tuning in, make sure to go follow the Animation Centrifuge Facebook page, so you'll see it right now on screen and also at the start. And I'll also be showcasing all of Fraser's artwork along the podcast as you're tuning in. Once again, thanks so much for coming on, Fraser. That's been
My pleasure.
that's been one of my favorite podcasts yet. And as always, if you're tuning in, make sure to subscribe. If you're we've just hit 2,000 subscribers on YouTube, so thank you so much for everyone who's been subscribing. And we will see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.